Good evening and welcome to the LSU Law Paul M. Hebert Law Center. We are here all together with this amazing amalgamation of supporters of LSU Law and the Rubin family to hear tonight about the Rubin Visiting Professor of Law lecture. And I want to thank you, first of all, for coming and continuing to support the law school and all of our endeavors. We couldn't do what we do without each and every one of you in this room. I am the interim dean of the law school, Caprice Roberts, and I'm very, very pleased to be serving this role, and it appears it may continue for a bit, so hopefully you'll be pleased too. But we have so many exciting things happening at the law school. If you want to hear more about that, just email me or many of the faculty in the room, and we'd be happy to set up a time with you. But this event is why we're here tonight, and this event wouldn't be possible without the generous support of the Rubin family. On behalf of the Law Center, thank you for joining us and for this program that's going to honor both the judicial excellence and enduring legal influence of course, the life and legacy of Judge Alvin Rubin. This Rubin lecture commemorates the life and legacy of Judge Rubin and the heart of today's lecture. Judge Rubin, of course, was an extraordinary jurist whose contributions to American law continue to resonate decades after his service on the federal bench. You're going to hear all about that from our guest speaker. Judge Rubin, of course, is admired for his intellectual rigor, his clarity of thought, his unwavering commitment to justice. His opinions reflect not only technical mastery, but a deep understanding of the law's human consequences. If you've read anything from the works of Justice Cardozo, as well as Justice Brennan, they often talked about judges need to have both heart and mind, or reason and passion. It's about how do you balance those, and I think that Judge Rubin represents that. It is this combination of scholarship, integrity, and humanity that the Rubin Lecture seeks to preserve and examine. We are especially honored tonight to welcome a speaker uniquely qualified to reflect Judge Rubin's legacy, and that's Judge Darrel Papillion. He serves as the United States District Court Judge for the Eastern District of Louisiana, and he was nominated by President Joe Biden in 2023, as well as confirmed, importantly, by the Senate with a bipartisan vote. Since joining the federal bench, Judge Papillion has presided over a broad range of significant matters, including complex civil and criminal proceedings, which he, of course, continues to do. These underscore the judiciary's vital role in public life. Prior to his appointment, Judge Papillion enjoyed a distinguished career in private practice as a founding partner of Walters Papillion Thomas Collins LLC in Baton Rouge, where we'd love to keep you, but we understand, where he focused on personal injury, wrongful death, and complex litigation. He also provided exemplary leadership to the legal profession in Louisiana, serving as the president of the Louisiana State Bar Association and the Baton Rouge Bar Association. His ties to the institution, and by that I mean the Paul M. Hebert Law Center, are also deep and enduring. He has served as an adjunct professor of law with us since 2000, and we're incredibly grateful. The students love his courses. He contributes meaningfully to the education and professional development of our law community. In recognition of his accomplishments and service, LSU Law named him the Distinguished Alumnus in 2025. He is a native of Swords, Louisiana, and Judge Papillion, of course, is of French-speaking Creole descent and is widely respected for his commitment to mentorship, cultural preservation, and increasing opportunity within the legal profession. His career began in public service as a law clerk to Chief Justice Catherine D. Kimball of the Louisiana Supreme Court, an experience that helped shape his understanding of the judiciary's responsibility to both the law and the public it serves. This evening's lecture, The Immortal, Life and Legacy of Judge Alvin B. Rubin, offers an opportunity not only to revisit the work of an exceptional judge, but also to reflect on the qualities that allow judicial influence to endure. Judge Papillion brings to this task the perspective of a scholar, a teacher, and a sitting federal judge, making his reflections particularly meaningful. Please join me in welcoming United States District Court Judge Darrel J. Papillion to deliver the 2026 Rubin Visiting Professor Lecture.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. I see so many faces of friends. One of the first things I was going to say is what an honor it is to deliver this lecture. And that's what everyone says when they stand up to deliver a lecture like this. They say, it's an honor. And so let me say, it's an honor because, you see, in the history of the speakers for the Alvin B. and Janice Rubin Memorial Lecture, this lecture has been given by 3 members of the United States Supreme Court. Indeed, the inaugural lecture in 1993 was given by Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who would be followed in 1995 by Justice Anthony Kennedy, and in 1996 by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And over the 30-plus years that this lecture has been given, no less than 5 United States Circuit judges, including 3 from the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, a court on which Judge Rubin served, would deliver this lecture. So would current or former deans or professors from Berkeley, NYU, Harvard, Stanford, and Penn, along with a justice of the Supreme Court of Canada and a justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. But until tonight, no Rubin lecturer has been a United States district judge. And until tonight, no Rubin lecturer has been a graduate of LSU Law School. While I am certainly no Alvin Rubin, it is my great honor to deliver this lecture. And I know now that some of you are thinking, my, how our standards have fallen. But to you, so many of whom are graduates of the LSU Law School, I would say this is part of the talk, this talk about Alvin Rubin, proud graduate of the LSU Law School, and almost certainly its most distinguished graduate. His whole professional life was nothing less than a demonstration, a master class, if you will, in what an LSU Law School graduate can do. And so, finally, after nearly 35 years, let me begin by saying, as Alvin Rubin certainly would say from time to time, go Tigers. And I do have photographic evidence that I was at that first lecture 33 years ago. So let us begin with the title. Immortal. Why is that the title? We know that sadly, and much too soon, on June 11th, 1991, Judge Rubin left the confines of Earth and he moved into another realm. That's a loquacious way of saying he died. But did he really die? Immortal. The Oxford English Dictionary gives us both a nominative and a figurative definition of this adjective. As an adjective, it means not liable or subject to death, literally deathless. So, in a literal sense, an immortal is one who does not die. But the word has a figurative meaning. Those of such great achievement that they live forever through their work. So you tell me, is Alvin Rubin dead? I believe he's very much alive. In fact, I believe not only is he immortal, he's omnipresent still. As the younger members of the audience might say, he's trending and his stuff is on blast. And if there's a first-year law student, they might say, he's fire. Why? Why are we still talking about Alvin Rubin 35 years after he passed away? Why are there at least 3 annual or nearly annual legal seminars named for him? Was it because he was brilliant? Lots of brilliant people get forgotten. Was it because he was a really hard worker? Hard workers get forgotten. Was it because he was a federal judge? Wayne Bora was a federal judge on the Eastern District of Louisiana and the U.S. Fifth Circuit for 37 years, and he was very highly regarded. So was Dominic Augustin Hall. He was on the district bench and the U.S. Fifth Circuit. In fact, he was the first federal judge in Louisiana. You ever heard of him? You ever been to the Bora lecture? No offense to Judge Bora. But they're not trending. Was it because Judge Rubin taught at LSU for over 40 years? Well, you know, there are lots of oil paintings of our school's great professors who only the oldest or the nerdiest of us can name without reading the plaque. Is it because he's Mike and David Rubin's dad? Is it because he spun off legions of brilliant law students? Was it because he was a great husband and a father who cared deeply about humanity? Surely not. The world's cemeteries are filled with millions of forgotten great husbands and fathers. Could it be as simple as preordination? It was his destiny. It has been said by no less than John Minor Wisdom that Alvin Rubin was born to be a judge. On that point, the photographic evidence seems to bear it out. In a memorial volume of the Louisiana Law Review published in 1992, and yes, there was a whole volume of the Louisiana Law Review dedicated to Judge Rubin. At the University of Texas, too. But John Minor Wisdom said, "That's why I say Alvin Rubin was born to be a judge, a great judge. His intellect, scholarship, and judicial leadership place him in a select group. In recent years, some of this small group graced the United States Supreme Court, Holmes, Brandeis, and Cardozo, two others, and with whom he would have melded should he have been on the court, but for, and we will talk about this, an accident of politics, as in Alvin's case. Learned Hand and Henry Friendly, these judges would have welcomed him on equal intellectual terms and as a kindred spirit. Alvin would have been especially comfortable, I think, with Brandeis and Cardozo because of their strong sense of injustice. So, what did Rubin do? Why was he so great? Well, he was, of course, the valedictorian of the LSU law class of 1942, the editor-in-chief of the Louisiana Law Review, and a member of the inaugural LSU class of the Order of the Coif. He kept good company. Future United States Senator Russell Long would finish third in that class. The class of 1942 was a wartime class. Our nation was at war. And Alvin Rubin enlisted in the U.S. Army as a private in 1942. He attended officer candidate school, and he served 2 years in the European Theater of Operations. He earned 3 combat zone ribbons. He was promoted to captain and was released from active duty in 1946. He would serve as an assistant judge advocate in the U.S. Army Reserve from 1948 to 1952. He loved America. 1946 was a big year for him. He left the service. He became a Baton Rouge lawyer. But most importantly, he married Janice Rubin, a young woman who, like him, was from Alexandria and someone he had known practically all his life. This would perhaps be one of the most important keys to his immortality, because she was every bit his equal and would prove to be the perfect partner and best friend to him for nearly 50 years. They were married 80 years ago this month in California. They decided to make Baton Rouge their home, and he joined the highly regarded firm of Sanders and Miller, which would soon become Sanders, Miller, Downing, Rubin, and Keene. It was in that same year, 1946, that Alvin Rubin began to teach at LSU Law School, something he would do for another 40 years. It has been said that at one time or another, he taught every course in the law school catalog. Alvin Rubin was what they would call a lawyer's lawyer. He was a real lawyer, an expert in business law and tax matters and wills and trusts. He was a lawyer and a counselor. He was not someone who merely pushed paper around his desk or whose whole legal career was advancing some particular cause or interest. His clients were people, individuals and businesses, people he knew and got to know. They needed his advice, they needed counsel, they needed help solving a problem, and Alvin Rubin was their lawyer. His lifelong friend, Harvey Posner, would describe him this way: Alvin was exacting and demanding of himself, and he expected others to measure up to his own standards when they were involved in cases with him, whether as an ally or an opponent. Or as another great judge said of him, more importantly, Alvin Rubin never lost sight of the fact that the legal profession is an honorable undertaking whose members have an obligation to serve the needs of their communities as well as the parochial concerns of their clients. Those words were spoken of Judge Rubin, LSU law graduate, by United States Supreme Court Justice Byron White. He handled all kinds of cases and he had all kinds of opponents. Speaking of LSU, there's a picture of Ernest Morial being sworn in as an assistant United States attorney in the Eastern District of Louisiana. He'd become a state court judge and mayor of New Orleans in 1977, the same year that Alvin Rubin would be elevated to the U.S. Fifth Circuit. But before either of these LSU lawyers became judges and legends, once they square off as opposing counsel in a personal injury case in Baton Rouge, Rubin's client prevailed. You can see Shepard versus Robin, 152 Southern 2nd, 285. This is Judge Louis Oberdorfer, who's was a famous federal judge in the District of Columbia. He was nominated on the same day that Judge Rubin, to the district bench, on the same day that Judge Rubin was nominated to the U.S. Fifth Circuit. He worked in Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department in the tax division. He got the better of Judge Rubin back in '64. Judge Wisdom, writing for the majority, affirmed E. Gordon West's decision that American Bank and Trust in Baton Rouge was not allowed to carry back certain operating losses, but Judge Rubin put up a good fight nonetheless. Had he never become a judge, he would, on the quality of his work as a lawyer and a law professor alone, he would have still had a Hall of Fame career. He and his wife prepared the Louisiana Trust Code Handbook. He wrote a guidebook for abstractors. Those of you who are my age and older will remember he and Dean Henry George McMahon, a Boyd professor of law at the law school, prepared the formularies, a set of form pleadings and judicial orders that Louisiana practitioners and judges could use in these things we used to call the green books. He was extremely active in the Baton Rouge community. He was the head of so many community organizations. In 1962, he received one of the highest honors that you can receive in this community, the Golden Deeds Award. Now, in 1960, New Orleans was, in that census, the 15th largest city in the country. The oil and gas industry was booming. There was no middle district of Louisiana federal court. Louisiana's Eastern District encompassed all of what is the current Eastern District and the Middle District. And while that geographic area is now served by 15 active federal district judgeships, in the early 1960s, there were only 4. And not long before that, there had only been 2. In the 1960s, though, Louisiana had one of the most powerful congressional delegations in the country, with 2 veteran United States senators in Allen Ellender and Russell Long, along with some very powerful U.S. congressmen like Hale Boggs and F. Edward Hebert. But few were more powerful than Senator Russell Long, and in 1966, through his leadership, Congress would create 4 new federal judgeships in the Eastern District of Louisiana. And in those days, as today, U.S. district judges are nominated by the president. on the recommendation of a state's United States senators. And while a United States senator can't necessarily make someone a federal judge, no person ever becomes a federal judge without the backing of his or her home state senators. And like I like to tell my law students here at LSU, you never know who you're sitting next to in class. In Alvin Rubin's case, we probably knew where this one was headed. But this law school has made a lot of U.S. senators. And this particular senator had a very close relationship with the former Senate Majority Leader, the former Vice President, and the President, LBJ. And so it came to pass that Alvin Rubin was appointed to a newly created seat in the Eastern District. And so after nearly 20 years in Baton Rouge that he spent teaching at the law school, building a law practice, serving his community in innumerable ways, Alvin Rubin had to move to New Orleans. Why do you have to move to New Orleans? Well, that matter is governed by federal statutes and sometimes, in addition to federal law, by the edicts of an en banc district court. And in Alvin Rubin's case, remember, there was not yet the Middle District. There was in those days a federal statute that said that one of the judges in the Eastern District, that was literally in the United States Code, one of the judges in the Eastern District of Louisiana had to be a resident of East Baton Rouge Parish, and Judge E. Gordon West, a close contemporary, was presiding as the district judge in the Baton Rouge division of the Eastern District. So brand new federal judge Alvin Rubin had to move to New Orleans, and he soon found himself working literally in the French Quarter in the building where the Louisiana Supreme Court is today by day, and on Walnut Street, literally a stone's throw from Audubon Park at night. Now, one of my colleagues on the bench in the Eastern District of Louisiana, a judge who's really well qualified to pass judgment on other federal judges, appeared in front of Judge Rubin many times when Judge Rubin was on the district bench. Judge Eldon Fallon put it this way: well, when Alvin got here, this bench was pretty loose. The judges were very busy. They each had about 800 civil cases, and the lawyers got away with a lot. In those days, you'd show up for a pretrial conference with a witness and an exhibit list, and that was it. Now, those of you who have experience in federal district court will find the following statements shocking. In the minds of Louisiana federal judges in the 1960s, if the lawyers didn't want to push their cases, the judges would just let them sit. And so they sat. Whereas today it's often said, there are no 3-year-old cases in federal court. I would just add the caveat, that's because they all get transferred to the new judges, right? But in the early 1960s, it was not uncommon for a federal civil action to take 5 years to work its way through. And then Fallon says, well, that changed with Rubin. He was strict. He pushed the lawyers. They didn't like it at first, but they came around. He was really a first-class judge, probably the best judge before whom I ever appeared, Eldon Fallon. Now, to put those comments into perspective, in 2017, the Rubin was given by noted NYU and Harvard law professor Arthur Miller. I went to a seminar last year for federal judges, and Arthur Miller was on a panel, and it had to do with MDL litigation, and he said, now listen, you people, if the MDL panel assigns a case to you, first thing you should do is call Eldon Fallon down in New Orleans and get his advice on Rubin. Fallon said, probably the best judge before whom I ever appeared. Wood Brown, a noted New Orleans lawyer, said it this way: there are some judges you can outthink. There are other judges you think you can outthink, even though you cannot. With Rubin, you never even got the slightest impression that you were out in front. He had the intellectual horsepower to move from one complex problem to another almost at the turn of a page. He had the managerial ability to get good lawyers with super egos to work together toward the completion of a case. I could go on and on, but I asked another great federal judge, why was he so special? And he said, well, first of all, he was brilliant. He practiced law across such a wide spectrum of practice areas that he was adept at everything. We used to joke that Alvin Rubin, as a lawyer, had handled everything from A to Z, literally administrative law to zoning. But what made him really special was that he was a good person, a really good person who cared about other people, cared about doing a good job and getting things right, and he cared about justice. This judge said, you know, there aren't many of us left who practiced in the old Eastern District Courthouse in the French Quarter. Judge would walk through a throng of lawyers and litigants to get through the courtroom. No private elevators, not a lot of security, but he did all that. I'm really lucky to have known Alvin Rubin, said Carl Barbier. Carl Barbier would handle the biggest civil case in U.S. history, the BP oil spill. He too might be able to evaluate a judge. He said he had a little cabinet behind his desk with all these slots. And if you met with him, he would pull out a piece of paper from a slot and he would give it to you. And it was his form for a pretrial conference or a form for this. And it had charges that he had worked up. Just pull them out. He says, so when Barbier clerked for Fred Casabry, who was a close friend of Judge Rubin's, he said, when I left my clerkship, I took every one of those forms and said, and for years, I would come to court and I could be in front of any judge and I would pull it out and I would say, Your Honor, this is Judge Rubin's form. It was great. I didn't have to cite any cases. Once I said it was Rubin's form, they said, okay. And on and on. He says, last one perhaps about this, he says, it's funny what makes a good judge. Rubin was brilliant. And my judge, Fred Casabry, would often say, you know, Judge Rubin is so smart. I wish I had a mind like Alvin Rubin's. But if you ever walked behind Rubin's bench, you would see these little cards about the size of an index card, and on them he had written or had typed the word patience in all caps. And Rubin would say, I wish I had Fred Casabry's patience. He didn't suffer fools easily, but he had a way of letting a lawyer or the other offending party know that he wasn't buying what they were selling, and he wasn't going to let them get away with what they were trying to get away with. But he wasn't ugly or condescending. He could deliver the message in the right way. He handled some incredibly important cases, including the Tangipahoa Parish School desegregation case, caused a cross to be burned on the lawn of his house in New Orleans. He and his family were put under the protection of the U.S. Marshal Service. And he continued, while doing that, as I'll talk about in a moment, to teach at LSU. When he learned that about half of his docket in New Orleans was going to be admiralty cases, and he had not, despite having such a varied legal career, he had not done a lot of admiralty and maritime work. And so what would you do if you're Alvin Rubin and you haven't done a lot of admiralty and maritime work and it's half your docket at the federal court in New Orleans? Simple. He volunteered to teach admiralty at the LSU Law School. By the way, trending, The 23rd Annual Alvin B. Rubin Conference on Maritime Personal Injury will be held on April 10, 2026 in room 110 of the Law Center, because he's immortal. Because I know that if a person is going to try to teach at 5:10 in the evening at LSU Law School and you work downtown in New Orleans, you got to leave New Orleans not long after lunch, James Brown, to predictably avoid traffic problems. How did Rubin do that with everything else? Well, I'll come back to that, but this is what the bench looked like in about 1972. We know this is 1972 or later because Fred Hebe is seated in the spot reserved, Judge Dick, for the chief judge, there front and center. Judge Rubin obviously is standing in the back, and you have the group of judges there. We know that it's after 72 because Gordon West was the chief judge when the Middle District was carved out. Otherwise, West would have been in that picture. And so that is a period of time about 1972. We think it is Hebe's first picture as chief judge. Alvin Rubin, distinguished federal judge, he often took the Magazine Street bus to Canal Street near the quarter where the courthouse was located. So in 1966 or so, the Magazine Street bus was a 45-minute ride from uptown to downtown. Why is this a great thing for Alvin Rubin? Because he's Alvin Rubin. First, he was a horrible driver. And his family laughed loudest. He was a horrible driver. And now that he had somebody else driving the bus, he could read briefs and dictate for 45 minutes with no air conditioning and who knows who on the bus. I have to confess, I live about 60 seconds from the Ferret Street bus stop, and I've only thought once about pulling a Rubin. And if I ever do it, it'll be a dire emergency or just because I want to be like Alvin Rubin. And how did he, a lot of you in the audience know this, how did he manage that getting to Baton Rouge problem? Well, he took the Greyhound bus from downtown New Orleans to downtown Baton Rouge. And he had one of his law students pick him up at the bus station before class and bring him back after class. And of course, because he was Alvin Rubin, he would work all the way. And, that is part of who he was. So we're going to elevate him soon enough, but this beautiful portrait of him hangs very appropriately so in the Russell Long, appropriately so, Federal District Courthouse in Baton Rouge, because he was a great Baton Rouge federal judge. But the nearly 11 years he spent as a United States District Judge, a solid quarter of his career in the law was in the Eastern District of Louisiana. So he's very much ours too, and we claim him in immortality. This year, the Hale Boggs Federal Building in New Orleans, named for a great Louisiana congressman who disappeared in the Alaska snow just a few years earlier, the Federal Building in New Orleans will celebrate its 50th anniversary. That storied brutalist cathedral of the law where Carlos Marcello, former Governor Edwin Edwards, Ray Nagin, at least 2 Orleans Parish District attorneys and scores of others have stood trial on federal charges, where the BP Horizon and Katrina Levy breaches cases, or Miles versus Apex Marine and Costano versus American Tobacco, OnCall versus Sundowner Offshore Services, and so many big cases were born. Big, seemingly impenetrable, imposing, hard, and serious place. It too has the immortal fingerprints of Alvin Rubin all over it. He would only be a judge there for a little while, but he was the chairman of its building committee in the early 1970s, and our courthouse has a number of features for which Alvin Rubin was responsible. Judge Rubin, among his other many great contributions, was instrumental in procuring out of there the Clement Meadmore abstract sculpture that sits outside our courthouse on a plaza between the Eastern District and the Fifth Circuit. Most people don't know this, but this statue is on a pedestal and it can rotate. And Fallon claims that, yeah, you'd see Rubin out there, he twisting it around, it'd face one way one day, face the other day, the next. And so before I elevate our immortal friend to the circuit, it's important to note another special accomplishment of his that I think factors into his immortality. So every year, about 2,000 of the nation's brightest recent law school graduates begin federal judicial clerkships all over the country. And whether some bright kid from Harvard Law School is headed off to clerk for Sarah Vance or Shelley Dick or Amy Coney Barrett, or as an LSU Tiger coming to clerk for me in the Eastern District or one of the judges in Baton Rouge, you're likely to be given, maybe a PDF these days, a copy of the Federal Judicial Center's handbook for law clerks to federal judges. The one that they get now is the 4th edition. Whether they're clerking for John Roberts or Sonia Sotomayor, they can look inside and they can see that the 4th edition is a successor to the original handbook prepared by our immortal Alvin Rubin and his law clerk Tony DeLeo in the 1970s. So in 2019, LSU's Heisman Trophy winning quarterback Joe Burrow reportedly said of the eventual national champion LSU Tiger football team that they would play anybody, anywhere, anytime, including on a gravel road. And that's kind of how I feel if I were in charge of trying a case over whether Alvin Rubin was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, one of the greatest federal trial judges in American history. But he is, of course, remembered most for his towering role as a U.S. Fifth Circuit judge. Edith Holland Jones of the U.S. Fifth Circuit had this to say about Judge Rubin. Deciding a case by the application of legal reasoning is a task many lawyers can do. Getting to the core of the dispute and resolving it in such a way as to contribute to the law requires artistry, and Alvin Rubin was an artist. So there were two concepts with him that were uniquely intertwined. They're related concepts, but they're not the same thing. And they were, or are, the rule of law and justice. And agreeing with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who said, a society with no other scale than the legal one is less than worthy of man. Judge Rubin added, but a society without a measure of law is a lawless society. Rubin said further in a journal article, the legal system should leave some play for conflicting demands, and no judge should be locked into a mental mold that shapes his every future decision. The judge whose decisions are entirely predictable is one who is not influenced by changing events, by reading briefs, by considering arguments on both sides of a dispute, by thinking carefully about an issue with the knowledge that real people will be affected by his decision, or by the craftsman's need to explain that decision. The craftsman's need to explain that decision. Edith Jones said Judge Rubin was fond of saying, let's write a little. He was particularly apt to write in cases involving pro se litigants so they could understand why the court was ruling the way that it was ruling. Lawyers represent clients. I'll explain why Jimmy Carter's up here, I promise. Lawyers represent clients. Our adversarial system is one that pits, hopefully, one good advocate against another, each fighting mightily for their client, and again, hopefully, through the crucible of trial or the litigation process, through the filter and the funnel of the application of the science of jurisprudence, of some reason and methodology, of the application of the law to the facts, we get the truth. But the advocate's role is to protect his or her client, to fight for them in a fair and honest way, with candor to the tribunal and fidelity to the law. That is not what a good judge does. The judge has no side. The judge has no client. The judge has no agenda. The judge's only side, only client, only agenda should be justice. And the tools of justice are the law and that judge's mind. Alvin Rubin's opinions reveal time and again fidelity to both the rule of law and justice. And so, Jimmy Carter's the president. LSU was doing really well at that time in terms of the law school, it is. And so in the 1970s, with Carter in the White House and Senator Long as powerful as ever, it came to pass that Alvin Rubin was elevated to the U.S. Fifth Circuit, back to the rule of law and to justice. He didn't confuse those two. A person guided by only his own concept of what justice is cannot be a judge, can never be a judge. A judge operates within the confines of the law. Judges operate within the confines of the law. They don't make the law. So whether it was in the realm of desegregation of schools, voting rights, the service on juries, the rights of mentally handicapped children, Alvin Rubin's writings show a devout fidelity to the rule of law. Yes, he was a compassionate person, but he was compassionate to both sides of the case. You couldn't predict how Alvin Rubin would rule. It depended on the law. It depended on the facts. One of his law clerks would say, Judge Rubin frequently coupled his analysis and discussion of ongoing cases with references to equity and justice. The law clerk went on to say that while Judge Rubin was a steadfast believer in the rule of law, regardless of his own view of the rule, Judge Rubin also made clear that we should never lose sight of the court's duty to apply those rules of law in order to achieve justice. Another law clerk of his said, a judge is someone who shares Judge Rubin's openness to understanding the other's point of view, his compassion for those without power or status, and his commitment to the rule of law. So, back to the original question. Why? What is so special about Alvin Rubin? Here I find myself in the unusual and the unenviable position of disagreeing with the great John Minor Wisdom. I don't agree with wisdom. In the absence of that kind of transcendental evidence that we can't weigh in a courtroom, and the existence of which I'm not excluding, I cannot find by a preponderance of the evidence that Alvin Rubin was born to be a judge, or, as Wisdom said, born to be a great judge. Part of the reasons for judgment on my finding that Alvin Rubin was not born or preordained at least not before 1966, to be a judge or a great one, is that when he became a judge, he was in fact such a good one that if he had been preordained to be a great judge, well, then he would have been on the United States Supreme Court. Are there less talented men and women than Alvin Rubin? I won't answer that. I won't name names. This is a very wise jury, and I will leave it to your judgment. But when was the last time you got a flyer for, you can insert the name of some particularly not very impressive former U.S. Supreme Court justice? When are you going to their lecture? If it was his destiny, why would it have ended on election night, November 4, 1980, when the president most likely to appoint him to the United States Supreme Court, that's why Jimmy Carter was up there, received only 49 electoral votes? He needed 270 electoral votes to be president of the United States in 1980, and he needed those 270 votes to fulfill Alvin Rubin's destiny. If that was his destiny, I don't think it was. And if it was his destiny, why didn't the other guy appoint him? We know he was well qualified enough. That president appointed 4 people to the United States Supreme Court. Back to this for a moment. Look, if Carter, people say all the time, well, they say that, we don't know what Carter would have done. Yeah. Okay. See, it's Rubin sitting. Russell Long's hand on his shoulder. In 1977, he was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, which had jurisdiction over all of the federal revenue and a substantial portion of government spending from 1965 to 1981. I showed you earlier, he was pretty close to Carter. I would also say here, he appointed, Jimmy Carter did, 56 judges to the federal circuit courts. The very first one that he appointed was Alvin Rubin. He nominated Rubin first. Someone else was confirmed about a day earlier, and so Alvin Rubin became the second circuit judge in the Carter administration. I don't know. I think it looked pretty good for him to be on that court. And as I said, the president who followed Carter, President Reagan, appointed 4 people to the U.S. Supreme Court. Of the 4, one of them was the first person to give the Alvin Rubin Memorial Lecture in 1993. Another was so impressed by Alvin Rubin's dissent. So those of you who try cases know Edmondson versus Leesville Concrete. It's the case that is like Sybil Batson. People still call it, it's like Sybil Batson, but Batson is the criminal case about the improper use of peremptory challenges to exclude people from juries on the basis of race. And so Edmondson versus Leesville Concrete was a case that arose in Vernon Parish, Louisiana, where a black gentleman was involved in an automobile accident. He was around Fort Polk with Leesville Concrete was the defendant. And there was an issue about whether race had been improperly used in the peremptory challenges. Judge Rubin was on the original 3-judge panel, and he wrote the panel opinion saying that it constituted state action and was against the law. The case went before the en banc U.S. Fifth Circuit. The en banc circuit reversed the panel, and the Fifth Circuit's opinion was now an en banc decision. That decision went up to the United States Supreme Court. But now that Rubin sent something with it, he sent a very strong dissent. And the judge who would deliver the Rubin lecture in 1995, Anthony Kennedy, wrote the majority opinion in that case. And a lot of you know this. He knew what the court was going to do. He had seen Judge Rubin at a conference in San Francisco, and he was very impressed with the Rubin dissent, the original Rubin opinion, and it formed sort of the DNA of his majority opinion in Edmondson versus Leesville Concrete. And so he decided that he would write a letter saying to the effect, I couldn't tell you about it when I saw you in San Francisco, but I wanted you to know how impressed I was with your dissent in Edmondson versus Leesville Concrete. And I want you to know that the court has gone the way you went with that case, and the opinion's going to come out very soon, and it had just come out. But Alvin Rubin never got to read that letter because it appeared on Anthony Kennedy's desk, ready for him to sign. Before he could sign it, he got a phone call telling him that Judge Rubin had died in 1991, in June of 1991. And so he took the unsigned letter and he prepared another letter to Janice Rubin that said, I believe that for the sake of history, you should have this letter that I was going to send to Al. I don't write letters like this, I'm paraphrasing, but I thought you should have this letter, and I hope everything's okay with you. And so he wasn't on the United States Supreme Court, but the first three people to give this lecture were Supreme Court justices. Oh, and they knew all about Alvin Rubin, trust me. In fact, Ruth Bader Ginsburg appeared before Judge Rubin in federal court in New Orleans when she was a lawyer. So we'll never know. I do find that he was not born. Why do I keep saying that? He was not born to be a great judge. He wasn't preordained to be a great judge. I think he was forced to be. He was made to be. He was made to be a great judge in his parents' home in Alexandria by his immigrant parents, who held in their hearts a dream of a better way of life in this great country. He was made to be a great judge by growing up in the rural South during the Great Depression. He was made to be a great judge at LSU Law School. He was made to be a great judge by serving in Patton's army in Europe. He was made to be a great judge when he married an incredible woman and raised two outstanding sons to adulthood. Alvin Rubin was made to be a great judge, one that would one day be called immortal, because most of all, more than any other thing, he was mortal. He was human. He was not perfect, and he knew he was not perfect. He won almost all the time in almost everything he did. But sometimes things didn't go his way. And like all of us, he had to overcome that and move on. He was fond of talking about the vicissitudes of life, a change of circumstance or fortune, typically one that is unwelcome or unpleasant. And so when litigants appeared before Alvin Rubin, he was prepared for them. And I don't mean the preparation that we think of when we think of Alvin Rubin. Of course he had read the briefs. Of course he knew the case. He was prepared for them. He was prepared to be the judge because life had prepared him. That is why he is immortal. There are so many fine lawyers and judges and law professors, and husbands and fathers and wives and members of organizations of the world. They're good people who are not that smart, and they're smart people who are not that good. But with Alvin Rubin, everything came together. Each part of him related to another part that built on that other part. And so after reading case after case and law review article after law review article, I came to the conclusion that Alvin Rubin's unique talent, his hard work, his integrity, had all coalesced in a powerful way to make him such a great judge. And after I did all of this, I came upon a passage in a particular law review article, because I've been reading all the ones about the law that I intended to read, I planned to read, but hadn't read. It was the law review article written in 1992 by his wife. And I was greatly relieved that she agreed with me. But I was very frustrated, like the person who starts to write a law review article about a theory they have, and then they find in doing the research that somebody else already wrote the article. But here's what she said. Alvin was the jurist he was because he was the man the boy became, a man who remembered biblical injunctions about relationships and courage, about discipline and standards, about justice and mercy and integrity. A man whose goal on the bench was the oath taken by judges on the Isle of Man. You shall do justice between cause and cause as equally as the backbone of the heron doth lie midmost of the fish. Thank you very much.
All right, we have a gift for Judge Papillion. Thank you so much. That was just an amazing lecture and studies. So much, Judge Rubin. And thank you to the Rubin family and all of you. And now it's here to celebrate, unless you want to say questions, I don't know. Didn't say that. But we can have questions informally as we eat and drink and enjoy each other's nonsense. Thank you so much for coming.